From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The House committee investigating the January 6th Capitol riot finishes its third public hearing. What is it doing to prevent the next contested election? Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial writer Mene Ukwe-Barua. Happy Friday to you both. On Thursday was the third hearing of the House Select Committee on the Capitol riot, and to my eye, we have gotten, Kim, again, some more details, filling in some color of what happened that day. But where's your sense now that we're three hearings in of where the committee is going overall?
Well, it's clear that the committee is presenting and trying to make a public case, the public case, that Donald Trump was wholly responsible for the events of January 6th via his actions leading up to that event and his words on the day, etc. But it also is becoming more clear as we watch these, given the language and the repetition of certain statements, that the committee is actively debating sending a criminal referral to the Department of Justice, asking it to prosecute Trump either on a conspiracy charge or something even bigger like sedition or treason. It's amazing the words that they've been using. And they continue to keep referring to this federal judge who oversaw some of the debates about what documents the committee would be entitled to get, noting that this judge has said that Donald Trump likely broke the law. The reality is that it's a liberal judge who probably doesn't like Donald Trump much anyway, and his opinion doesn't really matter in this particular thing. But it does, they continue to stress this because it seems as though they're laying the groundwork for potentially taking that action themselves.
But in that kind of a civil context, the standard of proof that that judge was working under was more likely than not that a crime was committed, which is miles away from the standard in a criminal trial, which is beyond reasonable doubt. So to my eye, I agree with you, Kim. I think there's danger in going down the criminal referral route, particularly because there's been no evidence presented that President Trump was in contact with any of the rioters directly, that he urged any of the violence. The most notable thing to me in the hearing so far is we've gotten a better sense of what President Trump's legal advisors on the campaign and in the White House thought of these efforts. They were described in testimony on Thursday as nutty and crazy. And we learned that one of the lawyers that was advising President Trump, John Eastman, apparently sought a presidential pardon. So some new details being filled in, but I think far from what they would need for a criminal case. And let's listen to a little bit of President Trump responding about the committee. Here he is speaking today at the Faith and Freedom Coalition in Nashville.
The Unselect's entire sham presentation is based on video that has been deceptively edited, misleadingly cut, and even doctored. They doctored Jim Jordan, who just left. He just told me they found something that he said they doctored it up. I think it was actually Schiff that did it. They took the entire meaning out of it. I said, good, you don't mind if I mention that, Jim, do you? They're taking 6, 8, and 9-hour depositions, and they're putting up 5-second clips, making everybody look bad. They'll take 9 hours worth of depositions, destroying people, trying to destroy them. And out of the 9 hours, they'll put up a 5-second clip where they got a little tired. They ripped completely out of context these statements in many cases to create an impression that's the exact opposite of the truth, so that what you're seeing is a complete and total lie. It's a complete and total fraud.
So my read of this is that that's not quite true, because if the Attorney General, Bill Barr, testifies in a clip that the committee plays that he told the president these fraud claims were baloney, and he started to worry that the president had lost touch with reality, I have a hard time understanding how you could take that out of context and suggest that Bill Barr meant the opposite of that, and this is just deceptive editing. On the other hand, the president makes a fair point, I think, that the committee has so far not provided the full depositions of these people, and maybe it should give the public greater access to its underlying materials. It would add some credibility to what the committee is doing. On the other hand, it seems that a lot of Americans have already started to tune this process out. We're now 3 hearings in, and let me play a little bit of an important moment Thursday in NBC's coverage of these hearings.
He's one of the preeminent constitutional scholars of the United States.
As we come up at the top of the hour, we're going to have to end our coverage of this January 6th hearing on the NBC network. My colleagues and I will continue our coverage on the hearings on our streaming platform, NBC News Now. For everyone else, U.S. Open golf begins momentarily. I'm Lester Holt for NBC News in New York. Good day.
Golf, Monet. So that was Lester Holt explaining that he found these hearings apparently more boring than watching golf. I'm myself not a golf fan, so maybe that's an unfair statement, but it does suggest that the public's interest in this is starting to wane.
Yeah, that's a really illustrative clip right there, and I do think it must be frustrating and kind of disillusioning for a lot of liberals in the media and for the Democrats who are putting on these hearings, because to them, there's no more fascinating and important topic than the events of January 6th. They really do feel like sort of, tremendous violence was done to the Constitution, to the integrity of the American electoral system, and literal violence to the Capitol on that day, all of which is true. But I think by this point, most Americans feel that they have a good understanding of what took place on that day, and they repudiate it, but it isn't really at the center of their focus in the same way that it is for sort of the liberal establishment in this country. And so in advance of the midterms coming this fall, Democrats really thought that they could put on kind of a showstopper of a political event with these televised hearings, and that they would restore it to the forefront of political conversation. That has happened to some degree, and we are learning certain new things about what took place on January 6th, as we've said before. There are new details about how President Trump responded to the attacks or failed to respond in terms of getting sort of an armed response from the military to try to prevent further damage from being done. We're learning more about internal communications from people in the Trump White House, but generally they haven't really done anything to fundamentally change how people understand those events. And until they're able to put something really new and important forward, it's very unlikely that they're going to get the same degree of public response that they've been hoping for out of these hearings.
Another notable development this week, Kim, was some more controversy about communications that the wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas had. And the January 6th committee has now said that it will call Ginni Thomas, his wife, to testify. Can you explain what's going on here?
Yeah, so what this is the committee leaked that it was in possession of some sort of email correspondence between Ginni Thomas, the wife of Clarence Thomas, and John Eastman, who was the lawyer advising Donald Trump on this whole strategy of Pence not counting electoral votes and other tactics the Trump team tried to use to change the results. And this comes, don't forget, on the backdrop a couple of months ago, the committee also leaked that it had text messages between Ginni Thomas and Mark Meadows, the president's chief of staff. And this all seems to be very clearly directed at trying to put pressure on Clarence Thomas to recuse himself from upcoming cases or ongoing cases, anything that has to do with elections. Obviously, Justice Thomas is reviled by many on the left, and the committee seems to be playing some real politics here, because the text messages with Meadows, when you looked at them, they amounted to a great big nothing burger in which she basically exhorts him to stand tall with the president. And now we have Mr. Eastman, who preemptorily came out and with a statement or something he wrote saying that his own email correspondence with her was benign, and he actually attached an email that he had from her in which she just inquires if he can come present a status update to a group of grassroots state leaders about where things stand on presumably the election project they were working on. It doesn't seem, now it could be the committee has more, but it doesn't probably seem like it. And this just makes it look a little bit even more like this is a bit of a political hit job.
And the same with this story that Ginni Thomas apparently emailed some Arizona lawmakers after the election, asking them to set aside President Biden's win and directly choose electors. But if you read the Washington Post story on this, it is much less than the headline implies. Here's the detail. Thomas sent the messages using free routes, an online platform intended to make it easy to send pre-written emails to multiple elected officials. And so it sounds, Monet, like she pretty much clicked a few buttons on her computer and sent a form letter. A lot of public officials get these kind of form letters, and maybe hers was buried in with hundreds or thousands of others. And it seems like she had entertained some of the the wilder fraud conspiracy theories after the 2020 election, but there's no indication that I've seen that she did anything other than make up political arguments in her personal capacity, which she's free to do, whether it's prudent or not.
Right. I think for the past few months we've been getting, drip bits of information about what Ginni Thomas said in the wake of the 2020 election, communications she had with different officials, some of whom were in the White House or close to it. And it's important to sort of think clearly about what she did do and what she did not do. So most of the messages clearly show that she entertained some of the narratives about fraud in the elections on the part of the Democrats and held out hopes that the judicial system could be used to potentially redress some of these fraud allegations. But I don't think that anything that has come out from her communications rises to the level of conspiracy. Basically, she is talking to Mark Meadows, White House Chief of Staff, or to John Eastman, kind of asking them to basically remain resolved in the process of trying to probe for fraud and trying to get updates. In the case of Eastman, she was asking if he would come and brief an organization that she takes part in on where the process stood, but none of it rises to the level of sitting down with these officials and really trying to directly influence outcomes in a very specific way. And certainly the official she was corresponding with did not reciprocate in any meaningful way in terms of engaging her in that process. But I think what's even more settled than that is, as you said, she was doing this completely in her capacity as a private citizen. She never said or even implied that Justice Thomas was involved in any of these processes. And so what you've seen in the media is trying to insinuate that it rises to the level of conspiracy, trying to get one of these cases in front of the Supreme Court or tried to overturn a specific electoral count in one of these states. And they will intentionally use vague headlines to basically put that impression in the minds of readers. But when you get down to reading the text of what Ginni Thomas was saying and what the people she was talking to were saying, none of it quite crosses that bright line of conspiracy.
Hang tight. We'll be right back. You're listening to Potomac Watch from the Wall Street Journal.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Let's talk about a couple things that the January 6th committee, so far at least, has been missing. And one of them, Kim, to my mind, is much talk at all about the Electoral Count Act. This is the law that was passed in the late 1800s that purports to let Congress reject electors when it meets on January 6th. And there was a little bit of a mention of it at the end of Thursday's hearing, but Thursday's hearing was all about these arguments that President was making that Vice President Pence could reject electors. Then there were votes and Republicans voted to reject electors. And some people, including the Journal, have been calling for changes to this law for a long time. And I don't understand why we are not getting any bills that would change this and try to prevent the same sort of conversation from happening after the 2024 election.
The absence of the Electoral Count Act in any of these January 6th discussions that have been going on has actually been a bit surreal, especially that Thursday hearing, because as you said, the entirety of that hearing was devoted to the actions Mike Pence took. So we heard from his counsel, we heard a bunch of really interesting details about their legal analysis of the Electoral Count Act, how they'd gone back through every single election to try to discern what prior administrations had viewed the vice president's powers to be, and lots of information about Mike Pence's judgment on this in the end and his refusal to go along with Trump demands. So it's, in essence, it was all about the Electoral Count Act, even as though no one was talking about it. And I think the clear reason for that is that the committee knows that this is an action that Congress should have taken a long time ago to clarify a law that many of us think is probably unconstitutional. If we had not had it, we would never have had a January 6th. Some Democrats and Republicans came into office right after January 6th and began a discussion about repealing the Electoral Count Act, but then Democrats decided not to really get on that because they were far more interested in trying to pass their federal election takeover law, H.R. 1, So that got pushed to the side. And the other, even uglier reason is that Congress doesn't really want to deal with this because in some ways it also would abrogate its own ability to adjudicate certain disputes about electors. It shouldn't be in Congress's realm or the vice president's realm. It should go to the courts if there's a question there. But this is a question of Congress needing to give up some of its own power, and that is never something Congress is good at doing.
But Monet, I just don't think that a bill would have to be that complicated. Kim mentions that there are some bipartisan negotiations going on about the Electoral Count Act, and that's fine. Maybe we'll get to see soon what they come up with. But the basic structure of it, I think, has a few elements. One is clarifying the vice president's role. So the 12th Amendment to the Constitution says that when Congress meets to count the Electoral College, the vice president shall open all the certificates and the votes shall then be counted. And that last line, that passive voice, the votes shall then be counted, is part of what President Trump and his advisors were seizing on in 2020 to make the argument that the vice president had some significant power here to choose which ones might be counted. And so Congress could pass a law, and the first part would clarify that the vice president's role is purely ceremonial. He presides over the session. He opens the certificates, and they count the votes that states and state courts and federal courts have deemed to be valid. A second piece, which gets to Kim's point, is you could repeal or change the provisions right now that say that Congress, if it wants to, can reject electoral votes. And those provisions have been abused not only in the 2020 election, but I think after the 2000 election, 2016, there are several times in recent years where people have made phony objections to electors that there was no legal dispute about. And I don't understand. I get the argument that Congress isn't likely to give up power that it has found itself with. But it seems like now is a great time to make an argument that it should as we get closer and closer to the next presidential election.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And I frankly think that if you were to sit down and make those exact same arguments to Nancy Pelosi, she would have a really hard time disagreeing too. As far as the vice president's role in certifying the electoral count, I don't think that there's any serious legal scholar in the country who would say that the vice president is invested with the authority to change or even challenge the electoral count. It would be very contrary to the Constitution and to just sort of an understanding of how the separation of powers was constructed to suggest that the vice president could play any meaningful role in picking the president. So that's a ridiculous interpretation of the law as it stands, and it certainly wouldn't hurt to clarify that the vice president is merely presiding over the ceremony. And then with regard to Congress's role, yeah, I do think that the law as it's written obviously gives Congress the explicit right to challenge these electoral votes, and that right has been invoked several times in recent history by both parties. But it certainly doesn't seem to redound to the good to have sort of political actors in this position of being able to challenge these votes in this way. And as we have suggested, it probably isn't quite constitutional. I don't believe that it's been explicitly litigated before, but the Constitution gives that power to state legislators and the Electoral College and does not provide for Congress to be able to play that role, except in cases when there's a deadlock in the electoral totals. And so it would be very prudent to remove their ability to challenge those electoral counts. I frankly think the reason that they haven't done it is something that we've implied before, which is that they are hoping to make reforming the Electoral Count Act part of a broader change to the ways that elections function in this country. Obviously, they spent quite a lot of time trying to pass H.R. 1, which would have set national guidelines for how states administer elections in this country. And so, yeah, they probably are all in agreement, that is, congressional Democrats, that the law ought to be changed, but they just don't want to go ahead and do it, and in a way that might make it more difficult for them to then pigeonhole in some of the other reforms that they've been seeking.
A second thing, Kim, your Friday column makes the argument that Congress is missing bigger trends about political violence. What's the case that you're making there?
Well, the other thing that seems to be missing from these January 6 hearings is that January 6 and that riot, which is what I would call it, didn't happen in a political vacuum. We've been seeing rising levels of political violence from both sides of the aisle. Whether, go back to 2017, we had the shooting at the congressional baseball practice. We had the Charlottesville rally where a young protester was hit by a car and killed. We've had had the assassinations of police officers. We had all of the riots in the summer of 2020, many of which were violent, many of which did result in arson, including the torching of a federal courthouse in Portland. And there's a lot of outside analysis of these events, many of which qualify under what the government would call domestic terrorism, which the definition of that, according to the U.S. government, is when non-state actors engage in violence for political causes. And we need to ask the question of how we got here and why this is happening. And that is a very big debate. But we also need to talk about Washington's role in this as well, too. I mean, my point of that column was to say one of the reasons people feel compelled to take matters into their own hands and say, go and attempt to assassinate Justice Brett Kavanaugh is because they're being told by politicians that day after day, including members of the January 6th committee, that one side of the political spectrum is determined to take away all of their liberties and steal their ability to vote and, get rid of abortion and et cetera and so on. And it inflames people. And you have people on the other side of the aisle doing the same with their supporters. We really need to be having some discussions that aren't about that, but about Washington politicians standing up and trying to calm things down a little bit. And in that regard, I think the January 6th committee is missing some bigger points here.
One final point, though, on political violence, just to close the loop on something we discussed earlier this week. There was the bill that was passed unanimously in the Senate to provide protection to the families of Supreme Court justices. There was a strange delay in the House, but the House has now passed that vote. But Monet, 27 no votes. I find that a little hard to explain, and we'll give you the last word.
That's right. I think 27 Democrats voted against the legislation that was proposed to provide extra security for these justices. I think that if you asked them, they would say that there are so many other emergencies in this country, and we shouldn't advance this bill without acting on those. And specifically, I'm talking about gun legislation. So I think that's what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez cited as her reason for not voting for it. But frankly, that just doesn't pass muster. I mean, once we saw the real threat on Kavanaugh's life, our legislators should have treated this as an emergency and thought we need to make sure that security is there for the justices no matter what. And Congress should be able to just step up and address existing problems as standalone causes without saying we need to wrap everything else up into the same vote.
Thank you, Kim and Monet. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast app. And we'll be back next week with another edition of Potomac Watch.